Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfrey. I want to do nothing more than to welcome you to this building, the wonderful old India Institute, and say what the Martin School does is we bring together programs which tend to be interdisciplinary, looking at major problems of the 21st centuries. And one of the programs we're most proud of is on African governance. And I'll say nothing more but pass on to Stefan Durkin.
Very quickly, just say a few words. So the African Governance Program here based at Oxford Martin School, it's co-led by Ricardo Soares de Oliveira, who will moderate the panel today, and myself, so Stefan Durkin. So it's actually meant to bring different disciplines, especially more from economics and politics together to actually study issues to do with Africa and its governance. And of course, the topic of today really matters a lot in the way economics and politics comes together. So it's very opportune to have a panel like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. A warm welcome to all in person here at the Martin School in Oxford, and also for those of you joining us online. We have a very large audience online today. The subject of today's event is the role of professional facilitators in the United Kingdom in enabling money laundering and also reputation laundering. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting sanctions regime has shed light on the UK's harbouring of illicit wealth from around the world. It has also revealed the centrality of enablers in the legal and financial sectors in laundering oligarchs' monies and reputations. This was, of course, an open secret. For the better part of the last decade, a small number of brave journalists, think tankers, law enforcement officials, academics and politicians have been denouncing this, despite the UK's crippling libel laws. Data leaks such as the Panama Papers, the FinCEN files, the Pandora Papers have also shown this in a very meticulous way. But the current circumstances have galvanized public interest and created the best prospect yet for meaningful policy change. In today's event, we will be discussing past attempts at curbing professional facilitators, the inadequacy of present regulations, and the prospect of improvement through the upcoming economic crime bill, among other ongoing efforts. Most pressingly, we will be asking, after a decade of signaling reform intent, is change really about to happen? To discuss these matters today, we have invited Dame Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell, two of the foremost actors in this effort at tackling illicit money in the UK today. Dame Margaret Hodge has been MP for Barking and Dagenham since 1994. She previously served as leader of Islington London Borough Council from 1982 to 1992. She served as the first female chair of the Public Accounts Committee from 2010 to 2015 and held several government positions in the last Labour government, holding portfolios across education, work, pensions, and other business, culture, many other dimensions. Most recently, Margaret's interest in combating illicit finance has dominated her time as a backbench MP in her role as co-chair of the UK's All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Corruption and Responsible Tax. On my left, I have Andrew Mitchell, who has been MP for Sutton Coldfield since 2001 and was previously MP for Gedling from 1987 to 1997. He served in cabinet as Secretary of State for International Development from 2010 to 2012, and subsequently as government chief whip in the House of Commons. In 2017, he became a senior advisor to the African Development Bank. Andrew has extensive experience on development issues and is co-chair with Margaret of the UK's All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Corruption and Responsible Tax. Both Margaret and Andrew have worked cross-party and tirelessly to deliver on numerous policy initiatives which clamp down on dirty money, illicit finance, and money laundering. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to have you here today. And as discussed, Andrew and Margaret will make very quick introductory remarks. We will then have a brief conversation about 20-25 minutes, during which I'll ask some lead questions to get the conversation going. John Heathershaw, who's professor of politics and international relations at the University of Exeter and one of the foremost experts in this field, has led many large research projects in this field and is also the author of several books including Dictators Without Borders, which I think is one of the landmark books in this field, will be providing us with brief comments on the discussion. And at that stage, we will open the floor to your comments and to your questions. There will also be engagement with the questions from the online audience through Clara Boyer, who's somewhere in the audience and who's responsible for organizing, for managing the event. So without further ado, Andrew, if you'd like to start the conversation with some introductory remarks, and then I'll pass the word on to Margaret.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your very kind introduction and for the opportunity to discuss these important matters this afternoon. I wanted just to make some general comments on why this area is so important, and then Margaret, who is the real expert on all this stuff, will say something, I think, about the very specific subtext of this afternoon's discussion. But I'm very conscious that this is part of an overall wrapper about African governance and the challenges and whether the UK is finally changing. So I just wanted to make really 3 points about why this is so important. And the first is that although we focused most recently on Russia and Russian oligarchs and money stolen by that route, there is a most enormous amount of money that is stolen from the developing world. And there's pretty credible research work done, including by the World Bank, which suggests that the amount of money that is stolen from the developing world is something of the order of $1 trillion a year. And it is, you know, the failures of governance above all, which mean that bent politicians, corrupt warlords and business people are able to steal from states which don't have the right structures, the rule of law, the correct procedures to defend their innate wealth from being removed. And anyone who wants to understand the importance of all of this should read Stefan Durkon, whom I have the pleasure of working with at DFID, his book about governance, which effectively says it's about leadership. So where you have really good leadership, then you do build up these structures which stop this sort of thing from happening. So with this enormous amount of money that is stolen from Africa, particularly Africa, but other parts of the developing world, the UK, we now know, is hugely exposed as an inadvertent or advertent enabler, because we have a rule of law here. We also have overseas territories which come under the British flag and come under our Queen, and therefore have a quote-unquote rule of law where illicit funds can be deposited and where they are quote-unquote safe. And these tax havens grant anonymity, and it's why Margaret Hodge and I, cross-party, have tried to make sure that there's much more transparency injected, and that we have structures which are far more open and open registers of beneficial ownership. And the proof of the fact that we were quite effective at this is that in the British Virgin Islands some time ago, there was a demonstration, a mass demonstration, where I believe there were placards saying "Hang Hodge and Mitchell." So that suggests that we had got that right. So onto this afternoon's specific subject, given this enormous amount of stolen money from one form or another, the enablers of that, the accountants and the lawyers, the baddies will always be able to pay more and get the baddies will be able to get the best advice from these enablers. And we've seen it too. We've seen the British anti-crime agencies without enough budget, too worried that if they lose, what will the effect be on their reputations, and they just can't perform. And it's one of the big problems. And the extent of all of this is so clearly demonstrated by the Panama and Pandora Papers. It's very difficult to get the Treasury to make sure that there's enough money. The structures of maybe what they used to do in the old days in the city, where the takeover code was run by lawyers who, as part of their career structure, would go and work for the government service, and Freshfields and Linklaters and so on would top up their salaries. And it was part of the way in which you got to the top in those professions. Well, you know, the government doesn't operate like that in the policing and anti-crime stuff. And the second point on this is the difficulty of getting change through Parliament. And that is because when Margaret and I hove into view, civil servants have two reactions. The first is, I've already created a perfect bill, so why are these ghastly backbenchers coming and telling me it can be improved? And the second is the not invented here syndrome, which means that if it was possible to improve it, we'd already have thought of it. We don't need irritating backbenchers like Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell to tell us what to do. And so getting change is very hard. I asked Mrs. May whether she would implement the Magnitsky regulations, which are visa bans and currency and money freezing, and asked her the question, Prime Minister's question. She said no. Then the Russians used biological weapons on the streets of a British city, and a few weeks later asked her the same question, and she said yes. So, that shows you that engaging with the issue about whether it's a good thing to do or not is if it comes from the backbenches, is not often very well received. And the final point I wanted to give you as an example was we're hoping for another crime bill, which Margaret may say something about in a moment. But if you look at Companies House, you realize, it's the best possible example of all these difficulties. So Companies House, if you want to set up a company, Britain very proudly says we're the best country in the world to set up a company because it takes you 6 minutes to register your company at Companies House. And everyone says, goodness me, hasn't Britain got capitalism well sorted out? But in fact, if I register at Companies House, a company, and I say my name is Michael Mouse or Mickey Mouse, it will go through. So Companies House is a library. It doesn't investigate anything. And for a long time, Margaret and I have been banging on to the government, you've got to give Companies House powers. You've got to ensure the Treasury fund them to have those powers. And then Companies House, which from 2016, at least in theory, you had to say who you were if you registered. Of course, if you had a company in the British Virgin Islands, you would register in the name of the ABC Corporation rather than who you actually were. So I'm really just showing the huge difficulties. The new Companies Bill will apparently have a go at sorting out Companies House. It will deal with information sharing, the power to seize crypto assets, and it will set up a new kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency. But all those things require money, immense focus from government ministers with other things to do, and an unremitting commitment. And I go back to my first point, which is the reason the commitment is so important, is if we don't help these states preserve their assets so they can build up education and health services and a rule of law, the golden thread of international development, as David Cameron used to call it, then they will go backwards, they will be engulfed in conflict and in poverty, and all of those things, for reasons everyone in this room will understand, threaten our way of life in this country, as well as the way of life of the poor people who are caught up in those circumstances.
Thank you, Andrew. We had a question later on about specifically the African dimension, but you beat me to it. Obviously, the reason why we're convening this event is that we feel that the issues that are normally discussed as pertaining exclusively to Africa are actually part of a much wider global story. And one of the concerns that I'll return to is that even as we are having a conversation that seems to have a reformist bent to it, it tends to be a conversation about Russia, very targeted at Russia, not at systemic reform. But we'll come back to that.
That's why I thought
Exactly. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Margaret?
I'm going to try and make three brief points as well. The first is to put this into context. I started on this journey when I chaired the Public Accounts Committee. And Andrew's friend, David Davis, came up to me and he'd chaired it before me. And he said, I'll help you, Margaret. So I said, thank you, very grateful, hadn't a clue what I was doing. And he said, Vodafone, you've got to look at Vodafone's tax affairs. And I sort of looked bewildered, thinking, what on earth have the tax affairs of a private company got to do with a parliamentary committee that is supposed to oversee value for money? And then it came to me that, of course, it came to the heart of whether HMRC is efficient as to whether or not they collect the money in. And then we started the first thing, this is a slight digression, the first thing was we had a really boring session with Vodafone, with HMRC, and I was sitting there reading the papers on Sunday night thinking this is so tedious, and happened to pick up Private Eye. And Private Eye was running a story about Goldman Sachs' sweetheart deal. And I thought, oh, I'll ask them that tomorrow. And I won't go into the whole story. It was a very funny story, but the getting onto Goldman Sachs' sweetheart deal started this whole journey. That brings me to the main point, which is it is part of a spectrum. So I see economic crime. It starts with, we all buy an ISA. It then goes to, do you pay your cleaner by cash? It then goes to, you pay your builder by cash. And it again gets into economic wrong. It then gets into aggressive tax avoidance, economic crime. And I would argue that the real danger to the UK is not just that we are a jurisdiction of choice today for dirty money, with estimates of about nearly £300 billion of dirty money reaching our shores each year. And that's, if you put it into context, a quarter of total public expenditure. So it's a lot of money. But that has started to infect the public domain and politics. And you see that a little bit with the Russian funding of conservative politicians, the Chinese funding of Labour politicians, and you see it in contracts and things like that. So I see this as a big spectrum. And if we don't call halt, actually Britain's reputation and our success, particularly in the financial services sector, is in jeopardy, because in the end, you can't get rich on dirty money, sustainably rich on dirty money. And there's plenty of good money around the world, desperate to invest, and we would actually grow our financial services sector on that. So the first thing is the spectrum. The second thing is, you're right, we're using Ukraine. I mean, I've been banging on about these issues now for a decade, and we have had some great successes. Andrew and I, on the transparency with overseas territories and crown dependencies, was a moment of success. But if we can use Ukraine to tackle the challenge, I don't apologize for it. And of course, the challenge goes well beyond that. And you only have to look at the great leaks. Every leak that came out from the Panama Papers through to the Pandora Papers demonstrates how many world leaders were engaged in hiding their money, maybe legally, but often illicitly. It's a massive, massive issue. So let's use Ukraine and the moment that to try and tackle that. And what I was going to say is, we have published, Andrew and my committee, together with another parliamentary committee on banking, so we're making common cause across Parliament, have published a manifesto last week, 10 days ago, where we talk about tackling this on 4 fronts. So we have to look at regulation. We have deregulated the financial services sector, started under Thatcher, continued under Blair and Brown, to such an extent that it's become very easy to use all our corporate structures and our infrastructure to create avenues to bring illicit wealth into the legitimate system. So we have to look at regulation. And one of the issues, one of the arms, I mean, I talk about 4 arms of reform. One of the areas there is Companies House. Just to add to what Andrew said, it costs you 12 quid to set up a company in Britain. It's completely crazy. It costs you £1,220 to get a visa for a skilled worker. Yeah, just put that into its context. Completely potty. And we could quadruple the amount of money that you to set up a company, and that would give you plenty of resources to equip Companies House to do a proper job in unique identifying the beneficial owners, and then in also doing some red flag raising. So regulation is one issue. Enforcement is another. We are pathetic in enforcement. The Americans are slightly better. The Americans have just increased their budgets in enforcement for by 30%. They see it as a security threat, as well as a threat to standards of living and all that sort of stuff. We've cut ours by 4%. You look at the number of cases that have been taken around money laundering, it's declined by 35%. And you look at the agencies, they're hardly doing anything. There's a serious fraud office, more than, it's cut by over 50% the number of cases they're taking at the moment. So enforcement is the second arm, and we think that's partly through funding, and again, you could fund it by giving the enforcement agencies a percentage of the fines and assets that they seize in pursuing dirty money. The third one is transparency, which Andrew and I have done work around, and there is further work that the government brought in this first economic crime bill just at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, where property is used. UK property is a key way in which dirty money is laundered, literally laundered around sort of jurisdictions worldwide, and brought in buying property here in the UK. And we reckon £1.5 billion worth of Russian property here in the UK at the moment. And I mean, the figures, nobody has an accurate figure, but you're talking about billions of billions, as you say, elsewhere. So I think transparency is still an issue, and we've got some issues there which are difficult to tackle. So Osmanov, who is one of the Russian oligarchs who owned Arsenal and has now owned another football club, which I don't support, so I can't remember the name of. But anyway, he has transferred all his assets when they were supposedly frozen. He's transferred them into a trust. So how we actually get transparency around trusts without interfering in the right of individuals to set up, grandparent trusts for their children's expensive fees here at Oxford or whatever it is. That is a very difficult issue that we have still to crack. And if you could help us with that, it'd be great. But transparency, third one. And then the fourth one is accountability. At the moment, there is absolutely zero accountability for all the activity that takes place in this space through Parliament to the public and to campaigners and academics and all those that have an interest in the area. We have a proposition there where we should set up a joint committee of the two houses, a select committee of the two houses that would meet under Privy Council terms, so it would meet in confidence, that could look at all these issues, look at individual cases, and then do systemic reports that would reach the public domain. Finally, to enablers. Enablers, this is a difficult issue on which to build cross-party support. Some of these issues, it's easy, but enablers is tough. Our financial services sector has enjoyed massive growth through the deregulation that it's had, but they are at the heart of facilitating dirty money, and we have to. And they are never held to account. They always get away scot-free. And you just look at all the leaks. All of them are about enablers. Whether it's Mossack Fonseca or whether it's Applebee's or whether it's actually the Pandora Papers were really interesting because that went across the space of all enablers to see where they are, to show how they facilitate. In some places they collude. In some other instances they really do facilitate. And I learned about this early on in my journey when PricewaterhouseCoopers, for whom I worked for a couple of years before I became an MP, I hasten to add, literally they were mass marketing tax avoidance schemes, aggressive tax avoidance schemes by getting companies to take money out of the UK into Luxembourg. And they completely denied that they were doing that. It was seen as cool and good to do that. And that cool, you were a cool sort of person or a company or a financial advisor if you help people evade tax. And that, I think, has infected everything. But it is really important that we bring those enablers to account. And the difficulty is, one, they're a big sector, and it would cause a little bit of a ripple in that sector. And in the post-Brexit time, when the economy is also feeling the shudders of Brexit and the shudders of COVID and the shudders of Ukraine, there will be a reluctance on government side to do anything that destabilizes, even in the slightest way, the financial services sector. Secondly, they are very, very close to government. And there's nothing wrong with government talking to stakeholders, but there is something wrong when government takes that beyond that to allow undue influence on regulation, or allows revolving door appointments, or allows contracts, or allows public appointments to enter the fray. And they're a very, very, very powerful lobby. And you see that all the time. And the third thing I have to say with this particular government, and I don't hold Andrew in any way as part of this, but with this particular government, there is a very close sort of financial relationship between the Conservative Party at the moment and the financial services sector, which is deeply unhealthy and shows Britain losing its moral compass. So we're in a difficult time of tackling that very, very vested and powerful interest and holding them to account. But we see that as absolutely crucial. We have got a number of ideas in our manifesto as to how you start down that road. I'd be interested to hear from you if you've got other ideas, because we're in the market for those at the moment. And the only interesting thing finally to say is this has been for me, an interesting journey. I'm a sort of, Labour politician through and through, tribal Labour. But the only thing we'll get anything done in this space at this point is by working across parties. And I've talked now to Conservatives one-to-one in my room, lots and lots and lots of them from right across the spectrum of the Conservative Party. And there really is, people come from a different view to the same conclusion, but there really is very little resistance to regulating, to getting better enforcement, to getting stronger transparency, and to getting better accountability, to getting those 4 things implemented. So this is a moment in time when I think we could achieve change, and we've just got to grasp it.
Thank you, Margaret. Let me start with a question, with a quote from you. You said, and I quote, we, the UK, have become the jurisdiction of choice for every kleptocrat, criminal, and money launderer in the world. End of quote. To give our audience a sense of diagnostic, how did we get here? What happened over the last 30 years? I fully agree with your statement. How did we get here?
Well, I think it's partly the deregulation. So it started with the Thatcher Big Bang. It then it was the deregulation under Brown, Gordon Brown, and carried on with the Blair Brown years. So I think that deregulation made it, coupled with UK's always been a trusted jurisdiction. So, if you can get something done here, that was one aspect of it. I think our relationship with our overseas territories and crown dependencies meant we had the secrecy jurisdiction linked to us. And that was, really, that helped us a lot too. I think those are, and also we've got the biggest financial services sector. So when you're trying to, I think somebody talked about borderless money in bordered states. I think it's Oliver Bullock used that phrase. So if you're trying to shift money across jurisdictions, and we've got a very big financial services sector, the biggest, us in America, that was hugely important. We speak English, all those sort of things. I think that helped an enormous, and our enforcement is pathetic. So even where we do have rules, we completely fail to enforce them. So Companies House being the classic example that Andrew talked about. You can set up a company.
Law enforcement, the Secret Court Office, National Crime Agency, they're woefully undermanned.
And then we did things like golden visas, that brought more and more, that helped. And that was brought in by the Labour government in 2008. So there's a whole raft of things that brought in billions of money, lots and lots of Russian money, not elsewhere as well, but lots of it.
Andrew, what is the articulation between the City of London and the Crown dependencies and the British overseas territories? You and Margaret mentioned some notable successes that you've both jointly achieved in this regard. But the limits of those successes, the autonomy of these jurisdictions, as we can see from the British Virgin Islands pushing back over the last 2 weeks, what can be done? And first, how does it work? And second, what can the House of Commons, what can Westminster do to it that hasn't been done yet?
Well, just sort of eliding from your first question to Margaret, I mean, the fact is that the City of London is the top or one of the top 3 financial centres in the world. Plus you've had the deregulation, plus you have the rule of law. So, if you are a villain and you've got a lot of money and you're going to put it in London, you know that there are rules of ownership, there are property rights and so on, and you're going to sleep much better and you put it in a lesser jurisdiction. So that is the pull factor. And then it's been very difficult for the government, for example, on the British Virgin Islands, because the British Virgin Islands and the other Caribbean dependencies are a relic of empire. They were not big enough to stand on their own 2 feet when empire came to an end. So they've remained in this rather sort of odd relationship where they share our crown, the Queen, and they have appeals to British courts and to the Privy Council in certain circumstances, and they have secrecy. And this is a toxic combination. And so, for example, in the early days when Margaret and I were trying to make the case for open registers of beneficial ownership, and this got a real lift in 2016 under the Cameron-Osborne G8, where Britain declared that we would now have open registers of beneficial ownership, and the EU said that they would sign up to it in due course, but it all took a very long time, and it did not penetrate through to the overseas territories. And in that classic British way, what they said was, look, open registers where journalists and others can come along and can see who owns something. This is just a busybody's charter. What we will do is we will have closed registers, but we will ensure that any law enforcement agency in Britain, or indeed America or anywhere else, can come to us and get the answer to a question. And if it's to do with terrorism, we will answer that question within an hour. And on anything else to do with the law, we'll answer it within 24 hours. And everyone thought, that's a great idea. And then you got the Pandora and the Panama Papers published. And you saw why that doesn't work, because you don't know the questions to ask. You can't join up the dots on all this dirty money moving around the world. And you have to have experts, busybodies, civil society, journalists, investigators able to see what those dots are. And that's, the Panama Papers blew away any credible argument from government in Britain to avoid having having these open registers. And so we were able to impose it because the government didn't have a majority, and Margaret and I explained to the government they would lose a vote, so they caved in. And the way these things work, it was so obviously the right thing to do. And of course, what happens when Dominic Raab was the Foreign Secretary? He issued a written statement saying it was government policy to have all these overseas territories having open registers. And I sent him a note saying whichever official drafted that written ministerial statement should be promoted and has got a brass neck to do so, because you had this force down your throat. And he sent me back a WhatsApp saying, actually, I drafted it myself.
Margaret, I want to get to the heart of something which is implicitly why some people who understand these practices to be moral nonetheless are reluctant to go against them, which is it in the British self-interest to regulate these practices, or will that be economically negative because it will chase away some forms of business which are dubious but are lucrative? We see, for instance, what's happening with Russian sanctions. Dubai, which is already a very dubious jurisdiction, is benefiting massively from Russian financial flows. Or is it alternatively the reputational impact on the UK's harboring of these practices? Is that going to be more significant in the long run? In other words, what is the hard-edged business case for cleaning up?
Clearly.
I'd like to hear Andrew on that as well, please.
Okay, well, clearly the business community will argue that it'll be deeply damaging to the financial services sector. And we would argue back, I would argue, I'm sure, and Andrew would argue back, we both argue back, that you will not get sustained prosperity on the back of dirty money. You will, if you lose your reputation, if you look at all the indices, after the FinCEN papers, I think it was one of them, America has now downgraded us as a trusted jurisdiction, sees us like Cyprus. And that, we're now on that trajectory going down. And if you're not trusted, clean money won't want to come here. And there is so much clean money floating around the world that we can and should take advantage of our historic reputation as a trusted jurisdiction to build on that. But it's in all sorts of ways. They are making a FinCEN, I can't remember which leaks it was, but one of them with the banks in particular, I think it was the FinCEN papers, they fill in. You can just see it. Anybody who has anything to do with the bank, any of us having anything to do with the bank, drives you absolutely potty in the checks they do. I chair a charity at the moment, they need my signature. I can't tell you the hurdles I'm going through. It must cost them a bloody fortune, particularly because I'm a politically exposed person. So they're probably doing it. You are. I am. Yeah, I'm a really bad person. But and then you see the FinCEN leaks, which were these leaks of papers. What they were documents. The banks have to fill in this suspicious activity report. and give it to the enforcement agencies. And this is the American, FinCEN is the American enforcement agency. And what they clearly ruddy do is they fill it in their bureaucratic way, but they don't then do the checks that they do on the likes of me chairing my charity. They then carry on, they just carry on taking money because it's easy money to make, and it makes them lots and lots of money. And the other leaks we saw was actually, this was perhaps one of the most shocking. It was an early lesson for me. I don't know if any of you remember the HSBC leaks from Switzerland. They're known as the Falciani leaks. And out of that, it was, I mean, we were in the heart of that. This was the Swiss branch of HSBC, and anybody with any nous would see it was making much greater profits than any other bit of HSBC, but nobody thought why. And they were making it because they were encouraging their clients there to do tax evasion, and they were using it to launder money through. And the only response it's a very good example of the spectrum as well, the only response of the head of HSBC to all this was to go after the whistleblower. They weren't interested in what the whistleblower had found. They just wanted to get the whistleblower, and they tried to pursue him to the courts and get him done. And then the woman who was I'm sorry to say this, the woman who was in charge, she ran the audit committee for HSBC, Rona Fairhead, went on to become a Tory minister, a Conservative minister for trade. And she had evidence when she came to the Public Accounts Committee was purely shocking. You know, she should have, as head of the audit committee, this should have been the sort of red flags that she'd been looking for. Totally failed. And she really talked about the whistleblowers as the thief. And then the only other thing I would say about all this is the lawyers who are suddenly coming lawfare, which, you know, you're all hearing about a bit more. And a lot of you're subject to a bit of that. A lot of the investigative journalists who've written brilliant books. There's a brilliant book on Putin's people by, there's a load of really, really brilliant stuff. And Tom Bergin has written a book, a guy who works at the FT. They are now pursued by the oligarchs with lawsuits, which are, again, our leading law firms are making zillions out of. And if you're an oligarch, spending 4-10 million quid on just a legal case is nothing if you've got 12 to 20 billion pounds as your wealth that you've stolen from the Russian people. And that's another aspect which we have simply got to bear down on, you know, which is in our manifesto, to stop this litigation being used and lawyers in the UK using it for them to make money and to stop stories being told.
The basic problem is that the baddies run rings around the goodies. And so what we have to do is we have to try and even it up. That's the basic problem. The baddies have the money, they can buy the best lawyers, and we've got to make it more difficult. That's not just about tightening the law. It's about a whole series of things. When I got back into the House of Commons in 2001, having had a 4-year enforced sabbatical following the Blair landslide in 1997, I'd gone back to the city and was earning my living at Lazard. And you know, Lazard in those days had a rule which no Russians. And I can remember going to the greybeards in the bank and saying, I've got this deal and it's got X, Y, and Z to it. And the director would say to me, Andrew, we have a rule here, no Russians, and there's a Russian element in this, and you can't do it. And that was a sort of quality of judgment, which I think they deserve very high credit for. Now, when I got back in 2001, the Labour Party was in power, and they were introducing a series of restrictions to address the issue of money laundering. And I, having come out of the city, was very conscious of the fact that these changes and restrictions were in danger of impeding the good guys without actually fettering the bad guys. And I can remember asking the hapless Labour minister, how much money laundering is there in London? And they said, well, a lot. And I said, but look, you know, if there's $1 billion of money laundering, then these restrictions are probably massively excessive. And if it's 40 billion, they're probably nowhere near enough. And how can you bring in these regulations if you don't know what you're dealing with? Now, the reality remains that those regulations stopped good guys from practicing their business and carrying out their business, and loaded costs onto the consumers, and didn't really stop the bad guys. And then the banks realized that the thing to do was to report everything and swamp the regulatory authorities and report anything at all with a red flag. And then they're swamped, so you can't do anything about it. And this is the problem. We need to change the dynamics of a system where the baddies are always likely to succeed. And in what I said before, I was trying to demonstrate that even when we try to support the goodies, the system actually is quite inert in the way it handles it. And I'm much more wary of the Americans than I think Margaret is, because I think American justice means you either say you're guilty or you go to prison. You have to plea bargain. The case of Mike Lynch at the moment, I'm extremely perturbed by it, very perturbed indeed, because if he doesn't, because he has resisted being sent to America, extradited to America, he is by definition a flight risk. So if he goes to America to plead his case, he will be inside on the moment he lands in America in a horrible penitentiary. They will take 2 to 3 years to decide what to charge him with, and they will turn up on day one and say, if you plead guilty, then you will go to prison for 18 months in a rather pleasant place. And if you don't plead guilty, we'll have you for 30 years. And I don't think we want to go down anywhere near that route. And the other thing is that partly because the president comes from Delaware, where there's an awful lot of dirty money hidden anyway, they're not in the business of introducing open registers of beneficial ownership, but they are moving towards having closed registers of beneficial ownership. And in the case of America, that is a big deal. And maybe we'll get them to open registers in due course, but getting the American system to move to even closed registers would be a big bonus.
If I may, 2 very brief questions to both, and then we'll go to John Heathershaw, who will have some comments and some questions. The question I have for Andrew relates to what we discussed earlier. Some fear that this belated effort is still too Russia-centric and misses out on real structural reform. My own expertise is on Africa. And what I'm struck is that when you're dealing with Nigeria or Kenya or Angola or South Africa, the London names that crop up, we're talking about lawyers, bankers, management consultants, PR experts, in some cases even the sort of people that ease philanthropic donations to universities and think tanks and all of that. They're exactly the same individuals and firms. There's no Africa pipeline. They're the ones we've all been dealing with in the sort of Eurasia context, and yet they don't make the news, or at least in the current context, there doesn't seem to be appetite for action against all dirty money and not just Russia's. Am I too pessimistic here, or do you think that we're turning a corner here?
Well, I think that Russia is the crime of the moment. I think I'm not as pessimistic as you. I think we supported President Buhari, who got back a lot of dirty money from London. He did deals with people. He managed to get a lot of money back. We were cooperative in that. The case of James Ibori which happened on my watch, or the work to get him happened on my watch, was quite well done. Not perfect, but made some progress. I think we're very conscious, and that's the reason why I opened with this development thing, because the stolen money is estimated to be about 4 times the total flows of development money that goes into Africa, and that sort of puts it in context. And I think Jason Sharman, who like me is from Cambridge, and who is sitting in the audience, he's done a lot of work on this stuff from King's in Cambridge. And it's the whole waterfront we're going after. And I think the current focus, of course, on Russia and Ukraine has grown. It was pretty weak until the Salisbury biological weapons attack. It then got a lot stronger, and now it's getting stronger again. But never underestimate the inadequacy of the British authorities charged with clamping down on this. They are short of money, they are short of expertise, And this is not police work. You know, this is the work for the top accountants and lawyers in cracking these people. And the police tend to think it's the Al Capone theory, which is you can't do it on the complex stuff. So you do them for tax evasion or parking tickets or something. That you can't do it like that. You've got to get the best people going after the baddies and not working with the baddies.
Margaret, following from there, your cross-party work has been exemplary and there are real achievements to it, yet successive governments have failed to regulate, in particular, the facilitators. Is the moment now, is it different now, and why is that?
Well, we're going to push it. And this is why grasp Ukraine to look at the wider tapestry. That's sort of my message. You know, I never thought this would happen, and it has happened. So we're going to grasp it. And I think on the I think it is the toughest of the issues that we're confronting. So stuff you can do from here to create a sort of environment in which it becomes inevitable is really important. You've got to look at how they are supervised themselves. So all these advisors have professional bodies that are supposed to regulate them and also actually do promote on their behalf, you know, lobby on their behalf. They're absolutely bleeding hopeless at the moment. So we've got propositions in our manifesto to toughen up the supervision and the regulation, either by toughening up the government agency that oversees the supervisors, or there are various ways you could do it. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to introduce, and the Law Commission is looking at it, a new offence. It's very, very difficult to get at the facilitators at the moment because the whole of the law around liability for giving wrong advice or giving advice that leads to wrong action was based on sort of 19th century businesses, small single-person businesses. So we're trying to put in a thing of what we call a failure to prevent offence. And that is being looked at by the Law Commission. I'm really worried that the Law Commission won't report in time to feed it into the Economic Crime Bill, but it's another area that is hugely important. So that's the second thing. So we've got a proposition around supervision, a proposition around introducing new offences. The third thing is the accountability framework, an enforcement framework. So if you get tougher accountability enforcement, that opens it to public account. And if you can open to public account, that, you know, embarrasses some of these you know, household names in the financial sector and in the law that don't really want to get sullied with dirty money at the moment. And then the fourth thing, which is coming from somebody in the Labour Party, I think is really important. I think we should use their ruddy expertise. I've always felt that. So I think, you know, poacher turned gamekeeper a little bit in this area wouldn't be a bad thing, because we saw it in the UWOs that you did all the work on, that there just is not the expertise within government that can stand up to the professional expertise that is at the moment exploiting and creating this environment where, you know, we're the jurisdiction of choice for dirty money. So I would bring them in and I would make them all. I would use them on a, what's it called, no pay, you know, no fee, not pro bono. They won't do it on that basis, but no win, no fee. Yes. On a no win, no fee basis, and get a few poachers turned gamekeepers, and that I think would strengthen our enforcement. It's I don't think all my political colleagues would agree with me, but I think that's one of the ways through it.
Thank you, Margaret. We're going to hear some comments from John Heathershaw. We will then give Andrew and Margaret the opportunity to respond briefly to them. And then hopefully we should have about half an hour's interaction with the audience. And I know there's amazing expertise in this audience. So it's really, I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. John.
Thank you, Ricardo. So 6 months ago, almost 6 months ago, Ricardo and I, with colleagues in this room, from Exeter, Oxford and Cambridge, Tom, Maine, Tenor Prelec, Jason Sharman, and also colleagues in the US, published a report called The UK's Kleptocracy Problem, How Servicing the Post-Soviet Elite Damages the Rule of Law, with Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. A great deal has happened since then, and even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Kazakhstan crisis brought this issue to the fore. I will just reflect on this in light of the comments Andrew and Margaret have made, and finish each of those 4 comments with a question for the 2 of you. So what form might action in this area take? We've heard a great deal, and a lot of what I will say will sort of really just highlight or emphasize again the points that Andrew and Margaret have made. But I think, first of all, this requires long-term, but also short-term action. So in the sense that the deregulation of financial services created these problems, actually prior to that, the creation of the offshore system from about the 1960s. This is an historical evolution, a change in the nature of global political economy, of which London and the UK is at the centre, which has emerged over decades. It's going to take a long time to regulate that effectively. But there is this moment right now to do something about this, which is about recreating state capacity in this area. When the offshore system was created, the Foreign Office and Treasury basically said to the overseas territories we've just mentioned, you write your own rules and we'll go along with those. What we need is a new state capacity to deal with this. And members like Andrew and Margaret at the forefront are impressing government to do that. I was struck in the Queen's speech recently how kleptocracy was mentioned. This word was used in the guidance notes that the government issued. And I did a little check of Hansard and found that kleptocracy or kleptocrat had been mentioned 180 times since 1800. The most interesting thing about that was about 140 of those mentions were in the last 5 years, and about half of all mentions were since January of 2022, since January of this year. A number of them would, of course, been by Andrew and Margaret. And my question to you is, does this matter? If we establish kleptocracy, this is not a newfangled term, it's a classical term, as a principle in UK law, that if you're an enabler handling funds from a politically exposed person from a kleptocracy, which we can identify, we can designate, we can put on a list of high-risk third countries, is that something that can be established as a principle in UK law that we should press for and push for? Should there be a UK list of high-risk third countries, which might be a great deal better than that of the Financial Action Task Force list or the EU's list that we've followed previously? Secondly, it seems to me that action in this area must be moral, but also in our interests, and it is. Very often the moral value thrown against attempts to regulate is privacy. It's a great virtue in Britain. I sort of feel it should be one of those national values we teach to our kids in primary school, because privacy is often put out there against actually some of the Nolan principles that should, and indeed we hold out as those things governing public life, which include integrity, openness, and accountability. If you push back with privacy as a personal virtue, you're often pushing back against those Nolan principles. We see this in the universities world, where the failure to establish clear ethics of self-regulation about donations means that some of us have felt the need to push for a change in the law to force universities to publish their donations. And that's an amendment proposed by Jesse Norman to the Higher Education Bill going through Parliament now. But that failure of morality, which can be pointed out, also needs to be accompanied by a recognition that it's actually in our interests, in the way that Margaret discussed, and also in her losing our moral compass paper with King's College in March, to address this, because the research actually shows that the net value to the UK economy of a great deal of this activity is either negligible or negative. If it has a value, it might be through tax avoidance schemes, which obviously take from the public purse. If it's something like the Tier 1 investor scheme that's been mentioned, the research on that, actually comparative across Europe, shows that it has very little negligible effect, which is when it was ended, our current scheme was ended earlier this year. Part of the reason for that, of course, was that many dubious individuals, including sanctioned individuals, had been let into the country and got residency and then citizenship through that route. But there was also no real economic value to it. So a question that comes out of that really is, how do we convince the government of that? How do we convince the government that it's in economic interest, that that there's a slice of financial services that serves high risk, very wealthy individuals that may lose out. But the broader UK economy, very often in most of these occurrences of regulation, will not. Thirdly, it's political and requires political will. That's come very clearly from Andrew and Margaret's comments. Margaret mentioned unexplained wealth orders. It's a classic story, I think, of what often happens in this area. There's initial surge by the government, big announcement, David Cameron in 2016, we're going to do this, drawing partly on reports that Tom and Global Witness had worked on. Then the loopholes get built in as there's a certain amount of lobbying by the industry. But the key step is the third one, under-resource it. Make sure the whole system is sufficiently under-resourced in the National Crime Agency that it can't work, and then you don't use it. And that's what happens. Boris Johnson's government has not used an unexplained wealth order. It's been reformed now, but it's only fixed some of the problems, and we will see what happens. So how do we break that cycle? Because it seems to be that it does involve cross-party pressure, like the two of you are involved in. But how do we break that typical cycle that I've just outlined there? And finally, action in this area is international, or should be international, but in the sense of transnational. So it involves both partnership with other countries, but also with the private sector. Some of our researchers come up with relatively shocking findings. Maybe if you've worked in this business long enough, it's entirely what you would expect. But for example, UK measures on freezing property and doing those unexplained wealth orders or going after houses of some of those elites in the UK. What we know is if you are in exile, you may well lose your property. But if you're an incumbent in a kleptocratic state, particularly a kleptocratic state which has good relations with the UK, you will keep it. And the reasons for that are not that exiles are fundamentally more dubious, quite the opposite very often. And if we consider for a moment what that really means, that means that British law in this area is being driven by power relations in kleptocracies, power relations that exist internationally. So there needs to be, as has been discussed, a way of recruiting the private sector to a set of standards to prevent that happening. And I think that action on enablers, which has been touched upon, is something which seems to be at the top of the agenda, and it may be that's something we come back to, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. These are four extremely rich questions, so in the interest of time, I would ask you to either choose a couple of the questions or give doubtless very concise answers to those complicated questions so that we can...
I mean, I agree it's long term. The UK list of having a list of kleptocrats, interesting idea. But you touched on something there, John, which is a real problem that we haven't found a solution to, and I don't think UWOs are either. So we have frozen all these assets of all these kleptocrats around in Russia. We haven't seized them, and were the war in Ukraine to stop tomorrow, arguably they'd all go back. And we can't think through. So again, your help and support in us generalists getting to an answer to that one would be really, really helpful. How do we convince the government that it's in the UK's interest? It is really, 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 really hard because of the power of the enablers in our politics and in our politics today. It's just really, really hard. They're the only ones that, I mean, I bet you're never brought in to talk to Treasury officials, are you?
The Cross-Whitehall Illicit Finance Group actually has invited us, and Treasury are open to a degree, but it's in the last few months when they've kind of not been able to ignore the problem.
So we've asked for a meeting. I think Treasury is key to this, because I think, you know, I think you will probably find empathy in the Home Office. You'll probably find Bayes, you know, the business department as well. They're okay, but it's Treasury that is key. And you've just got to think of the power of the financial services sector. It's just is incredibly powerful. So all I can tell you is I'm having these amazing conversations with individual Conservative MPs, some of whom I look at their CV and they come up and they are sort of pro-Brexit, anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, anti-everything that sort of I hold dear. And I think, flip, what am I going to talk to this person about? And then they walk into the room and we start talking about Russia. And we find that there's a, we can find some common ground. And by the end of the conversation, they say they will support our proposals. So there's no, I think we can build a majority. I'm pretty sure we can build a majority in Parliament. I really do believe that. Whether you could overcome the power of the financial services sector in government, I think is the big challenge. And international, I couldn't agree with you more. We haven't talked enough about that, but I think Andrew always has a really good answer to this. Maybe you should go to Andrew, but I think, you know, we've got to try internationally, but that doesn't stop us acting nationally.
Also briefly. So that
Yeah, okay, well, I want to make 3 general points about your very interesting and expert comments. The first is that, I mean, I agree with you about the privacy argument, because that was what we heard about the open registers, that, well, people in Mexico will be kidnapped and so on. But actually, don't say privacy, talk about transparency, because at the root of this debate, it's sunlight is the best disinfectant. You want to have transparency. And on the political corruption point, all I would say is this. I mean, I think my own party, which raises a lot of money from the private sector, there is clearly too much Russian engagement there, and you know, it just doesn't feel right that we now have a Lord somebody of Kensington and Siberia. I mean, you just sort of know that there's something's not quite right about it. So that's the first point. The second, and it's not. The second point is this. It's not about geographies, actually. It's because, you know, if you say that there are these 6 bad countries, the baddies will just go out for another one. So it's not about geographies. And on the international point, I mean, you start from the basis, of course, what you need is an international convention, a sort of UN on financial crime, so that we can all sign up to the same standards, and then you can really crack down. I mean, it won't work. You will never, ever get agreement. The French will be perceived, and probably actually truthfully, going after the British on financial services. So they want particular things which I think will bear down on Britain on financial services. Other countries under the broad heading of internationalism will pursue narrow national objectives. And remember, at the moment we're operating, I mean, it's absolutely devastating I find it devastating that since the war, we've been building more international agreement, consensus, whether it's on trade or justice and the International Criminal Court. We've been building up, and the whole thing's been smashed to smithereens now by what has happened in Russia and Ukraine. And the international system is really on the back foot at a time when you need internationalism to tackle all the major problems of the world. So I don't think the international thing really works. On the final point I wanted to make, which was trying to rewrite the private sector and dealing with the under-resourcing, which is all about the baddies always winning. You know, recreating state capacity. You know, in the city, there used to be the takeover panel, maybe there still is, the takeover panel, and the takeover panel regulated takeovers. It stopped it being the Wild West when it came to a big company taking over another company, and it dealt with the code. Now, it's very close to the point we are discussing, because the government could never afford to hire the best lawyers and the best accountants to go onto the takeover panel. So the takeover code was administered by the takeover panel, and the people on the takeover panel were very senior lawyers and accountants who did it partly for the prestige, partly for their company, and partly because the governor of the Bank of England said, you Freshfields, you Linklaters, you will allocate serious resources to put that senior partner onto the takeover panel. And from the point of view of the individual, it was about their career progress. And from the point of view of the city, it was getting very expensive, very good people at no cost. And, you know, we require you brilliant academics to work out how we do this. But I think there may be something there about how you even up the odds, because everything we've come up with so far, the baddies have got the best guys.
Thank you, Andrew, Margaret, and thank you, John. And we're going to open the panel to discussions from the floor. I would ask you 2 things. First, please introduce yourselves, and the second one is keep the question relatively brief so that we can have as many questions as possible during the next 25 minutes. Sorry, we have This gentleman over there, Professor Carlos Lopez.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Carlos Lopez. I'm visiting fellow at Oxford Martin School right now. There was a lot of emphasis on the personal, individual type of situation. I'm more concerned from an African perspective with what corporations do. And beyond BEPS, how you can use current accounts in corporations to basically do all sorts of illicit flows become possible, and how the absence of regulation makes extremely easy for the companies to just do that. And on the other hand, almost at the other extreme, how there is over-regulation in terms of due diligence by the banks, not very effective in terms of stemming the problem, but creating the opportunities for big, large banks to justify withdrawing from African markets because, you know, the costs, the transaction costs of that regulation becoming prohibitive, and therefore facilitating even further this facility of corporations using the current accounts to basically transfer their monies illicitly.
I should add that Professor Lopez is the former executive secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and played a leading role in pushing the illicit financial flows agenda back in the days, although the African Union has since not really been a great actor in this regard. But Andrew, perhaps you could take this question.
I don't really have very much to add to what the professor has said. I mean, he's sketched out the problem. And it is, as you said, sir, it is that a lot of very complex regulation is ineffective at what you want to achieve. But if you don't have regulation at all, then you have an open door for kleptocrats. And that is a real dilemma.
Next question. Sorry, the lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Fikayo. I'm on the Contemporary China program. I'm doing my master's. So this is a question I've asked every British politician and or diplomat. Should I probably stand? This is a question I've asked every British politician and or diplomat that has come to Oxford since February. And I'll be honest, no one has quite answered the question honestly or directly, but I keep asking. So here goes. Illicit money has been flowing into the UK since like 1990 when Abacha was president of Nigeria. But it's only recently become news when Russia has invaded Ukraine. And my question is, what exactly is the message here to African dictators? Is the message that, you know, you can basically put all your money in London and it'll be fine as long as you don't invade another country? Because like the Pandora Papers revealed that at least 40 Nigerian politicians had property in London worth at least £250 million. And nobody did anything. But now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, we're going to change the laws. So is the message basically, do whatever you want at home, but don't invade another country?
Thank you, Fikayo. Margaret?
Well, I think we have answered it, but I'll answer it again. The message is mixed at the moment because we have a system in the UK that allows all that to happen. But what we are doing is using Ukraine to bear down, not just on Russian oligarchs, but also to bear down on whether it's from, illicit money from wherever it comes. I mean, I've done two debates. This is part of the Russian, on Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, both of which are so corrupt, and there's so much money that they've stolen from their people that's come here. So you can find endless examples. If you look at all the leaks, it's full of money coming out of sometimes actually quite jurisdictions that you don't expect it to come out of. What I will come back to you on, I'm often asked to speak at Commonwealth Parliamentary Association events where they bring people over to discuss how you should look after public money, how you prevent corruption. And I felt really comfortable doing that 10 years ago. You know, I talk about the systems we had in place. We had very little corruption. Today I feel embarrassed because I think that we have so opened our doors to it that we can no longer hold our head up and say we're a trusted jurisdiction that lives by the rule of law. I'm not even sure we don't do that, as we see with our wonderful Prime Minister. If I can just have a little aside on that one. So it's, I think it's a mixed message, but let's use this. Nobody is saying that it's just us. The most egregious case of where Britain, I know this is a little bit of a minute, but the most egregious case I've come across at the moment of where Britain has facilitating wrongdoing in the world was actually the explosion in the Lebanon with the ammonium nitrate, which was supposed to be going to Mozambique. It was supposed to be sort of fertilizer for Mozambique. And sort of a couple of months after it happened, one of the very great investigative journalists who works for Reuters rang me up and said, do you realize, Margaret, it's a British company that owns that ammonium nitrate in the warehouse in Lebanon. So I did my usual thing about, typical bloody, we've got an absolutely hopeless regulatory framework. Didn't think twice about it. And then about a month after that, we got overwhelmed with, the Lebanese Bar Association, various investigators in Lebanon coming to us. And what emerged in the end, it was a British company. It was set up by a company services provider in Cyprus. She put herself down as the beneficial owner. She wasn't. She told HMRC that it was a dormant company. It wasn't, because it was trading this ammonium nitrate. And that it then emerged that it was sort of Ukrainian Syrians who actually owned this, were the real beneficial owners. It wasn't going anywhere close to Mozambique. It was going to Assad, and it was being used for barrel bombs to drop on his civilian population. And that is, for me, the most appalling, egregious example of where our dreadful regulatory framework, our useless enforcement, our lack of accountability, and our failure to have transparency leads to terrible things happening right across the world.
So, it's a really, really good question. I would just say to you that it goes back to Stefan Durkan's book that, if Nigeria has a leader who is...
You're really shamelessly plugging the book here.
No, I'm not plugging my book, which is available in all good bookshops, just out the corner. Called Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. But anyway, but the point is, it's about the quality of leadership. So when Stefan and I were at DFID, DFID, its main work was trying to bring James Ibori's money, which had been distributed amongst his doctor, his wife, and his mistress, trying to get hold of that money. And the department did a lot of good in that respect. But you need a leader in Nigeria like Buhari now, who is intent on recovering stolen funds. And then you've got something to work with. And indeed, on my watch, we saw the people in the City of London police who are most engaged in this sort of work. And I uttered the immortal words never heard being uttered by any minister in any other government. You can have as much money as you can spend well to prosecute these causes. So although you're right in saying that there's been a very narrow emphasis now on old Soviet Union, Russia, the people who Margaret's done so much work to track down, actually the work of government was in Africa, and Nigeria being the place where there were the richest pickings, as it were. We focused on them very much. In answer to your second point about identifying these properties in London, that's what open registers are about. And what we require, the name attached to the property, Andrew Mitchell, Sania Batcha, so that there's transparency and we know who it is. And you can't just say it's the ABC brackets, BVI, close brackets, business.
Next question. We have a question here. Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, just for the people online so they can hear.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a master's student in international relations here at Oxford. I have a quick question. Thank you for your fantastic remarks and all the work you do. A quick question to Mr. Andrew Mitchell, but please feel free to comment as well. Just picking on up on the terminology you use, and I've noticed words like villain, goody, baddie. I'm quite fascinated by kind of the dichotomous, terms you've used, and I wanted maybe to pick up on that and say, is there an intention to to trying to change the public discourse around that? We've heard from Prof how kleptocrat has suddenly become a very much used word in the past few months. And, what more could we be doing to change the public discourse to bring awareness around this particularly pressing issue?
So all I'm trying to do is to use a neutral word that is not capable of being parsed. So I'm talking about baddies and goodies, and I'm inviting you to assume that the technical term is correct, because I think that makes it easier to go down this route in a way that is reasonably easy to comprehend.
Other questions? Professor Chris Adam there.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion. I think it's great. I want to take you back to this issue about transparency and accountability and ask for your reflections on whether you feel that voluntary mechanisms such as the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, have proven effective. You're talking about the need to put in place better mechanisms to drive both transparency and accountability. And this is now, nearly 20 years old. It was a Blair government initiative. It was taken on, I think, with a fair degree of enthusiasm by the Conservative government that followed. And I'm just interested in your reflections on taking stock. Is this a model that helps us? Is it a model that has run its course? Are there lessons to be learned from the successes and or failures of EITI to hold parties to a higher level of transparency and accountability in illicit transactions?
First of all, when I first went to see the OECD in 2010, 12, round about then, they'd been working on this since 1980. It's crazy how long it takes to. So that's the first observation. It's not even as recent as you said. The second is that the transparency only works if all the other bits are in place. So the quality of the data. I mean, it's just potty. Companies House is just completely so full of terrible data. It's not worth. Which is why we need the reforms to that. So you've got to keep revisiting these things, and then that data has to be used. And that means your enforcement agencies have to use it. You have to have accountability to the public through Parliament and through all of you doing work around it. All those, that's why I always talk about these 4 pillars, which I think are a way of looking at it. So I think transparency is a key ingredient, but it has failed us to date because actually, money laundering, dirty money has grown during the period that we've had it. And ironically, I would say Cameron and Osborne sort of got it. And I think if they'd been around for longer, we'd have made much greater progress. But they then disappeared. Theresa May came in, obsessed with Brexit, I think she just genuinely didn't have a space to think about anything else. And I don't think honesty and transparency is top of Boris Johnson's agenda.
And Margaret, you've been specifically beneficial ownership was a priority late in the Cameron.
Yeah. I think they completely got it. I think they really did get it. I mean, when we first sort of light on it, they were there with us. Whether there was always the ambivalence with the powerful financial enablers, they've always been very powerful, but they just got it.
So look, the EITI is absolutely brilliant. This is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. And what it says is if you are a poor country and you have resources, that first of all, an unscrupulous international business or company that comes in and knows the value of those resources and the country doesn't know them, you have unequal transparency there. So the EITI says you must be completely open about the value, and then it talks about the cost of exploitation, whether it's the people digging the stuff out of the ground who make the profit, or the country, which is the host to that asset, makes a profit, and what happens to it. And then extractive industry transparency means also that you try to see that the profit that goes to the country actually goes through to public services. I mean, that in a nutshell is what the EITI promote, and it takes money off businesses who think as part of their ESG and a part of their social responsibility, they should do it. Absolutely brilliant, and works quite well. My predecessor, Claire Short, a politician of totally different colour to me, but on this issue, we are absolutely one. She ran it and ran it very well, lived on a plane for 3 years, really, and driving these important points in places where it matters. A really good example of how you even up the odds in the area we're talking about.
Thank you, Andrew. And Clara Boyer has a question from our online audience.
So Anne Pitcher has asked, few policymakers and academics frame the issue of capital flight and IFF as a violation of human rights, though clearly there are all kinds of human rights abuses.
Clara, we can't hear very well.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Few policymakers and academics frame the issue of capital flight and IFF as a violation of human rights, though clearly there are all kinds of human rights abuses being committed. Would framing the issue in this way be a means of pursuing more trans and cross-national solutions to the problem?
Would what be a way
What human rights?
Phrasing it.
Human rights context. So that's Magnitsky. I mean, that's what
Essentially.
Magnitsky does that. And I think if you had Bill Browder here, he'd say, every time I put a case to any of the enforcement authorities, it goes into a big black hole. But I mean, it's, clearly if you can link human rights to illicit wealth, this is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And actually, it's even worse because with Bill Browder and Magnitsky, he's got a file he's written to 8 British law enforcement agencies to say, here is an issue involving this person and this money, will you investigate? And all 8 of them have come back and said, no, it's not for us, it's for someone else. So it's part of what Margaret was saying about the ineffectiveness of the regulatory and enforcement structure which exists in Britain, and why I'm beginning to think that we need more academic work on whether the takeover panel model might be a better way of putting some red blood corpuscles into this.
Thank you, Andrew. We're getting to the end of our we have a question here from Tina Prelic, if we can still accommodate one.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Tena Prelec. I'm a research associate here at the Department of Politics and International Relations. Thank you very much for the fascinating panel. So we heard very rightly about calls for reform and empowerment of the Companies House system.
Reform of Companies House.
Sorry, we heard from Andrew about how important it is to basically empower Companies House so that it's not just a library, but it actually provides an effective check for the system. I was wondering whether the Charity Commission is also part of these, the Charity Commission is also part of these discussions, and if not, why not? So I wanted to invite comments from Margaret on how exactly this process works, because from the perspective of us, researchers working on these topics, it's not very effective at all. So let me just share one example. So there was a multi-million-dollar donation coming from a kleptocracy on whose board of this charity there was a very clear DPEP, couldn't be more clear. And there was no information on the Charity Commission's website about the financials or anything about this company. We contacted it and we got something in response. We got the documents that said financial report £0 for the same years when a £10 million donation was made, very, very publicly. So it appears that this might also be a library rather than, an effective system providing checks and balances. So thoughts about how it works now and what would be necessary to do to empower it.
I think you immediately got a reaction here when the words Charity Commission were uttered. Both speakers somehow jumped forward, but Margaret, very briefly.
Well, when I chaired the Public Accounts Committee, we looked at the Charity Commission and its effectiveness or otherwise in regulating the charity sector. And again, they too have been starved of resources. So they haven't got the capability and capacity to do it. And they too are very much a library that just sort of takes in the information and doesn't look at it intelligently or even check that it's accurate. They too fail to work with other regulatory bodies. So, they should have a relationship with HMRC, for example, which is quite a critical relationship. beyond where the donations come from. And they just, we came across terrible examples of where they just didn't talk to each other, and therefore charities were being used for to bring in illicit wealth. I mean, they were being used to launder money. But there is a new chairman whom I'm going to meet. I don't know if Andrew's met him yet, but he's written to me, so I'm going to meet him. So we'll see whether he can make a difference. But they're not a good regulator either.
Are you looking forward to meeting the new chairman?
I can't immediately think who they are.
I can't remember his name, but he's written to me.
I mean, I think the answer is the Charity Commission has a whole series of its own problems, but it does do more investigation. Companies House doesn't do any investigation really at all.
Thank you, Andrew. And we're getting to the end of our session. I have a final question for both speakers to bring the question closer to us here at the university. Albeit the Oxford Martin School is a very special venue in the university, but also aloof from some of the university realities. But the question I have to ask you is, much of what we discussed here today had to do with illicit financial flows, with money laundering, and with the metropolitan service providers that facilitate this process. But at the end of that spectrum, after the money has been laundered and rendered legitimate, there's a process of reputation laundering, which is embodied in many forms. I mentioned earlier philanthropy to museums, cultural institutions, but also knowledge production institutions, and universities obviously loom large. Until 15 years ago, this would have loomed much larger in the US context than in the UK context. But in recent years, this has become a question that we as academics also have to tackle, as it were, at the end of that spectrum that you've been discussing throughout this event. You're looking at us from the outside. You're looking at us from Westminster. What thoughts do you have about that dimension in the cultural and educational sectors?
I think there is I think that academia has to think very carefully. And we know it goes into the school sector. There are a lot of schools that are accepting illicit finance. It goes into the arts. It's all over. As they try and actually, there's a lot of this. The purveyors of illicit finance try and get credibility and influence. It goes into our football clubs. It goes all over the place. So I think the university sector has got to think hard. You've got to think hard. You have a moral duty, and academic freedom ought to be something that you hold dear. And my experience has not been an easy one.
So my old college at Cambridge, where I'm a fellow, has taken money from Chinese private sector interests and has got into, Charles Moore writes about it every week in The Spectator, and it's sort of got a life of its own now. And the college has never concealed anything, really, so I think it's all a bit unfair. But the answer to your question seems to me to be, once again, transparency and openness. Yeah. And being a Tory, I want to impose that judgment on the educational entity receiving the money, that it should be open, and they must then decide whether they're happy to defend it to all their different stakeholders. And it seems to me that's the way to handle it. Can I just end with one story, which I think just brings together the complexity of all of this? It's my favorite story on this thing. And I was told about a very senior American expert in tackling corruption, who was persuaded to come and speak to the most senior people in Afghanistan. This is obviously before the Taliban took over. And he was persuaded to go because he was told that all the people there who were law enforcers would be there, and they wanted him to come and give a lecture to them on how to tackle corruption. And he agreed to do it, no fee, flew to Afghanistan, went to Kabul, magnificent theater, with all these people there who turned up to hear him tell them how to tackle corruption. And as he was delivering his talk, he looked down the front row and he realized almost everyone had a large Rolex watch. And he looked around and saw at what point they were taking notes about what he was saying. And suddenly, to his horror, he realized that he'd flown halfway around the world to brief the people on what they had to combat and get round from those who were enforcing law and order and anti-corruption. And I think it's such an interesting story. It shows you how really difficult and complex all this stuff is.
Margaret Hodge, Andrew Mitchell, thanks so much for this brilliant event. Please join me in thanking our speakers.